Homeware. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, two humans sat by a fire who were not related, not mates, not obligated to each other in any way. And yet they stayed close. They shared food they didn't have to share. They noticed when the other one was missing. Nobody had a word for what that was yet. But it's the same thing you'd call, today, a friend. Here's the strange part. Every single human society ever studied has this. Not marriage, not parenthood. Friendship, voluntary, unrelated, often unpaid closeness, shows up everywhere humans do. That makes it one of the most universal bonds our species forms. It's also one of the least examined. We've written entire libraries about romantic love. Friendship barely gets a chapter. So let's actually talk about it. First, a quick biology detour. It explains everything else. From an evolutionary standpoint, close bonds with family make obvious sense. You share genes with your kin, so helping them helps copies of your own DNA survive. Biologists call this kin selection. It's tidy. It's selfish in the most literal genetic sense. But friendship breaks that logic completely. A friend, by definition, isn't kin. So why would evolution bother building the capacity for it at all? Primatologist Robert Sapolsky and researchers studying baboons found part of the answer. Female baboons with strong, stable, non-relative bonds, essentially friends, had offspring that survived longer. Lower stress hormones, better group protection, more support finding food. The friendship itself wasn't the goal. Survival was. Friendship was the mechanism. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar took this further. He's the researcher behind the famous Dunbar's number, the idea that humans can only really maintain around 150 stable relationships. His research proposed something else too. That primate brains, ours especially, got bigger in large part to handle social complexity, tracking who owes who a favor, who can be trusted, who's a friend and who's just familiar. Later researchers have pushed back on some of Dunbar's specific numbers, and that debate is still active. But the core idea holds up reasonably well. Our brains may be oversized, in part, for bonding with people who share none of our genes. Which raises the obvious question. If friendship is that deeply wired in, when did it actually start showing up? Further back than you'd probably guess. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, form what researchers call special friendships. Two unrelated chimps groom each other constantly, share meat, back each other up in conflicts, and actively seek each other out over other members of the group. Franz de Waal, who spent decades studying primate social behavior, documented this extensively. If chimps do it, and we share a common ancestor with chimps roughly 6 to 7 million years ago, then some early version of friendship-like bonding is almost certainly older than humans ourselves. It's a reasonable, evidence-based assumption that early hominins carried this capacity forward, and that by the time anatomically modern humans show up, roughly 300,000 years ago, the wiring for non-kin bonding was already fully in place. So picture that. Long before agriculture, before writing, before anything we'd recognize as society, small bands of early humans were almost certainly relying on friendships, alliances with people outside their family, to survive. Extra eyes watching for predators, someone to share meat with during a bad hunting season, someone who'd remember you owed them, and who you owed in return. Here's where honesty matters. We don't know what they called it, if they called it anything. Nobody wrote it down. There's no journal entry, no cave painting captioned, "Met my best friend today." Anyone claiming to know the exact emotional texture of prehistoric friendship is simply guessing. What anthropologists can do is study contemporary and recent hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania or the Juhwanzi of the Kalahari, where researchers like Kristen Hawkes and Nancy Howell have documented something called fictive kinship. That's a formalized friendship, sometimes sealed with a name exchange, a shared meal, or a ritual, that carries real obligations similar to family, without any blood relation at all. Did prehistoric humans do something like this? We genuinely can't say for certain, but it strongly suggests that formalized, meaningful friendship isn't a recent invention layered on top of human nature. It might be closer to the operating system. Now here's the frustrating part for archaeologists. Proving prehistoric friendship existed in any specific case is close to impossible. And for a very unglamorous reason, friendship doesn't fossilize. A shared meal leaves no trace. A conversation leaves no trace. Loyalty leaves no trace. What archaeologists do have are indirect clues. Burial sites occasionally show unrelated individuals buried together, side by side, with grave goods suggesting some kind of significant bond. Though whether that bond was friendship, alliance, or something else entirely is very hard to say from bones alone. Tools and materials found far from their place of origin hint at trade and exchange networks, which almost certainly required trust between unrelated individuals or groups. And trust, at some point, tends to shade into friendship. None of this is proof of friendship in the way we'd recognize it. It's inference, built from what the evidence allows. So if you've ever heard someone confidently claim, "This is what cavemen's friendships looked like, exactly," that's not coming from a preserved artifact. There isn't one. It's a reasonable hypothesis dressed up as a fact. Once we hit actual written history, though, the picture gets dramatically clearer. Because now, finally, people were writing their feelings down. The oldest known story in human literature isn't a war epic or a creation myth first, not really. It's a friendship story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written down in Mesopotamia roughly 4,000 years ago, centers on the bond between King Gilgamesh and Enkidu, a wild man sent to challenge him. They fight. They become inseparable. And when Enkidu dies partway through the epic, Gilgamesh's grief is so overwhelming it sends him on a desperate quest to cheat death itself. One of the very first stories humans ever preserved in writing is, at its core, about losing a friend. A few centuries later, ancient Greek philosophy took the subject on directly. Aristotle, writing in the Nicomachean Ethics around the 4th century BCE, spent an entire section categorizing friendship into distinct types. Friendships of utility, where people are useful to each other. Friendships of pleasure, built around shared enjoyment. And what he considered the rarest, most valuable kind, friendships of virtue, based on mutual respect for each other's character, which he believed could only exist between equals who'd known each other a long time. That's not a passing mention. That's careful, structured philosophy, built specifically around the idea that not all friendships are equal, and that the deepest kind takes real time to build. Over 2,300 years ago, many other cultures formalized friendship even further, through actual ritual. Blood brother ceremonies, symbolically mixing blood or exchanging vows, appear independently across parts of ancient Europe, Africa, and Asia, historically documented among groups ranging from the Scythians to various African and Southeast Asian communities. In ancient China, Confucian thought placed friendship as one of the 5 core relationships that structured a moral society, alongside ruler-subject, father-son, husband-wife, and elder-younger sibling bonds. Friendship wasn't treated as a nice extra. It was infrastructure. So real texts, real ceremonies, real philosophy, going back thousands of years across cultures that had no contact with each other. But, and this is the pattern by now, actual personal accounts of specific ordinary friendships from antiquity are still rare in the historical record. Kings and philosophers got their friendships documented. Everyone else largely didn't. Historians are cautious about assuming ordinary ancient friendship looked exactly like Gilgamesh and Enkidu's, since the surviving sources skew heavily toward the powerful and the literate. Which brings us to a genuinely strange final fact. The version of friendship most people take completely for granted today is much younger than you'd think. For most of history, close relationships outside family were often shaped by necessity, economic interdependence, shared survival, formal alliance. The idea of friendship as something chosen purely for emotional connection, with no practical obligation attached, becomes far more prominent starting around the 18th and 19th centuries, as historians studying the period have argued, tied to changing ideas about individual identity and private life. Then came something that changed the entire shape of the word: the telephone, and later, the internet. For the first time in human history, you could maintain a meaningful friendship with someone you rarely or never saw in person. And then Facebook, launched in 2004, did something no prior era of human history had ever done. It took the word friend, a term that had meant something built slowly, tested over years, occasionally sealed with ritual, and turned it into a button. Click once, and you're friends. By the mid-2010s, the average Facebook user had hundreds of friends, a number that would have seemed absurd, maybe even meaningless to Aristotle, who insisted true friendship required years of shared history and could really only exist with a small handful of people. Let that sink in for a second. Humans have been forming deep, loyal, non-kin bonds for hundreds of thousands of years, arguably millions if you count our primate ancestors. And the word we use most often today to describe that bond has, in a single generation, been stretched to also describe someone whose face you scrolled past once. For nearly all of human history, friendship wasn't something you collected. It was something you built slowly, tested through hardship, and often marked with real ritual, because everyone understood, on some level, that it mattered as much as family, sometimes more. That instinct, the one that made an early human, sitting by a fire with someone who shared none of their blood, decide that person was worth protecting, is still running in the background of every friendship you have today. It's just older than almost anything else about being human, and somehow it's still the part we talk about the least.